To begin our program, I have the great honor to introduce the University of Chicago's Jens Ludwig. Jens is the McCormick Foundation Professor of Social Service Administration, Law, and Public Policy. As importantly, and for our purposes even more importantly, Jens is the director of the University of Chicago's Crime Lab and co-director of the University of Chicago Urban Education Lab that is providing us with the science to bolster our program allocations and investments in a time of scarce resources, so we're getting the greatest impact for our contributions. Very pleased to now bring up Jens Ludwig to lead our program.
Thanks so much to Terry and Commissioner Diaz for bringing us all together. It's a tremendous honor to be here talking to you about the kickoff of One Summer Chicago. I know many of you, I've had the privilege of working with you. I'm incredibly inspired by what you do. This is an incredibly important issue for a variety of reasons, maybe the most important of which being the terrible human toll that youth violence imposes in the city of Chicago, but not just in the city of Chicago. And unfortunately, as we all know from reading the newspapers day after day, it is very disproportionately concentrated in the most racially and economically segregated neighborhoods of the city. But the first thing that I want to point out is that this is a problem where the costs and the consequences of getting the youth violence problem right extend far beyond just the neighborhoods that are most heavily impacted. This is a problem that affects everyone in the entire Chicago metropolitan area. And getting this right is central for securing the long-term vitality and future of the whole city. My University of Chicago colleague, Steve Levitt, did a study showing that every homicide that happens in a city in the United States reduces the city's population by 70 people. If the city of Chicago had the same homicide rate as New York, their homicide rate is about 1/3 of Chicago's right now. If Chicago had the same homicide rate as New York, our population would have held steady or even grown slightly between 2000 and 2010, instead of declined by fully 200,000 people over that 10-year period instead. I think there are a lot of people right now who live in relatively safe parts of the Chicago metropolitan area, on the north side of the city, in the suburbs, who think that the youth violence problem is not their problem. I think those people need to go to Detroit and talk to the people who live in the suburbs of Detroit and ask them how happy they are to be living on the outskirts of a city that's struggling as severely as Detroit is. And I think that those people need to ask the people who live outside of Detroit whether they'd be happier instead living in the suburbs of a thriving city like New York. Right now, Chicago is basically midway between New York City's homicide rate and Detroit's homicide rate. I think this is basically the choice that everyone in the metropolitan area is facing moving forward. Now, I think the question then becomes whether there's anything that we can do about the problem. This is a picture from Englewood illustrating what we see far too often day after day in the most heavily impacted neighborhoods. I think the question then becomes whether there's anything that we can do to address the problem. There are a lot of things that we could talk about around youth violence in Chicago. There are a lot of potential solutions out there that good organizations have been working on. There are a lot of promising ingredients in One Summer Chicago itself. The thing that I wanted to do is focus on one example. I wanted to focus on one example, which is something that Terry mentioned, a collaboration between the University of Chicago Crime Lab and Youth Guidance and World Sport Chicago that provides a reason for hope that we can do something about this problem. Because I think one of the big fears that I have is that a lot of people, seeing the drumbeat of bad news on the front page of the newspapers day after day, may have basically given up on the idea that there's anything that we can do at all, okay? And specifically what I want to suggest is that there might be an angle on this problem that makes it much easier to solve than we have appreciated. Maybe as simple as getting kids to merely slow down in their behavior, think about what they're doing, and basically stop, look, and listen. Okay, and that's going to be an important part, in my mind at least, of one of the things that One Summer Chicago is intended to do. And so you might be skeptical or even think this is a crazy idea right now, but I hope to have brought you around by the end of the talk. I think it's really useful to start off thinking about what the youth violence problem looks like in concrete terms in Chicago. So I live in Hyde Park on the south side of Chicago. I work at the University of Chicago. June 2nd, 2012, this is just more or less a randomly picked example of the youth violence problem in Chicago. June 2nd, 2012, 3 in the afternoon, at the intersection of 73rd and Coles Avenue in the South Shore neighborhood. This is about 3 miles from my office at the University of Chicago. 2 groups of teens are in the middle of the street, 3 in the afternoon, woofing at each other about whether a kid in one group has stolen a bike from someone in another group and whether they did and where it is and if they're going to get it back and blah, blah, blah. The 2 groups start to separate when somebody in one of the groups pulls a handgun out of their waistband and turns into the other group and fires and hits a 16-year-old kid named Jamal Lockett right in the chest. EMS comes and they race him down Lakeshore Drive to Northwestern Trauma Center downtown in Streeterville. At that point, there's nothing that even the world's greatest trauma surgeon can do to save a 16-year-old kid who's been shot at close range in the chest, and the kid dies at Northwestern. Okay? One really, really important point to take away from there are 2 things that I want you to take away from this example. One thing that's really, really, really important about this example is that the way to really move the needle on the youth violence problem is not going to be improving the quality of medical care necessarily, right? There's only so much that even the best trauma surgeon can do with a chest wound for a kid. I think once we get the kid at the trauma center, we're basically on the flat part of the curve for trauma care. We really need to figure out a way to do a better job on the prevention side. We need to keep the 16-year-old kid from getting shot in the chest in the first place. Okay? A couple of weeks after the shooting, the Cook County State's Attorney, the police make an arrest. Cook County State's Attorney charges the shooter with first-degree murder, a 17-year-old kid named Calvin Carter from a far south suburb. Right? 17-year-old kid shoots a 16-year-old kid over a bike. All right? Now, the second thing that I want to emphasize with this is if the media portrayal of the violence problem in the United States is basically of the flavor of The Wire, right? So it's Snoop Pearson and Chris Partlow going out and making a hit against someone in a rival drug gang on behalf of Marlo Stansfield, the leader of their gang, right? That is what we think of from TV. And in fact, in Chicago, this is what the violence problem really looks like. To the best that the Chicago Police Department can figure out, something like nearly 3/4 of all homicides in Chicago are motivated by an altercation. Okay, so it's basically almost Seinfeldian in its genesis, right? It's an argument over nothing that turns into a tragedy because a gun is nearby at hand. In order to do something about this problem, we need to think about what it is that's causing it. So why do people engage in youth violence? And one of the most obvious explanations or potential explanations for this is the horrible poverty that we have in so many parts of the city of Chicago and in cities all across the United States. And the standard explanation on that front would go something like, when people are so materially desperate, they will do whatever it takes in order to feed themselves and their family, and it might make sense to do something as drastic as shoot someone else over a bike that surely wouldn't have a resale value of more than 20 or 30 bucks, right? This is a common explanation that we hear over and over again for what drives violence in our cities. There's a different explanation. So here's another common explanation that we hear all the time surrounding the way that kids are socialized. Right? So John DiIulio is a political science professor at the University of Pennsylvania who very famously argued in the 1990s that the problem behind violence is what he calls moral poverty. He says moral poverty is the poverty of growing up around deviant, delinquent criminal adults in abusive, violence-ridden, fatherless, godless, jobless settings. DiIulio argues that anyone is more likely to become criminally depraved when they're in an environment that's morally deprived, right? So that is another common explanation that we hear all the time. We need to better socialize our kids growing up. We need to address the poverty problem, all right? Both of those common explanations that we hear all the time lead to a sort of discouraging conclusion about what we can do to address youth violence, because poverty is extremely difficult to change. The poverty rate in the United States has not changed much for the last 30 or 40 years. And moral poverty, if that's an important explanation, is at least as hard to change. How do you get parents to fundamentally change the way that they are interacting with their kids growing up? Those two common explanations lead to the idea that violence is going to be very difficult to change, and that the kids, if kids are engaging in crime because of material poverty or moral poverty, that they're going to be deeply committed to engaging in crime, right? And it's going to be hard to move them away from that. So that paints a picture of committed criminals. That's my interpretation of what those explanations, the logical conclusion that they lead to. And it's not surprising that lots of us would have internalized the idea that people who engage in crime are very strongly committed to doing so. When you look at data from the US prison system, what you see is fully 2/3 of all the people who are released from prison every year are going to be rearrested within 3 years, 2/3. So of course you're going to think that criminals are committed, deeply committed to engaging in crime when you see the same people getting arrested over and over and over again. People, this is going to be your only Lindsay Lohan joke for the morning. You should appreciate it. You should also appreciate that a University of Chicago professor knows who Lindsay Lohan is. That's not a given. So what do policymakers do who think that it's really hard to change people away from engaging in crime? If you think that criminals are deeply committed to the act of engaging in crime and violence, that leads to the conclusion that there's only one thing that you can do, which is lock them up. In 1970, around the 1970s, the field of criminology basically gave up on the idea that there's anything that you can do to prevent crime or rehabilitate people who've started to engage in crime. And I think it's no coincidence that around that time is when we started to see what happened to the prison population in the United States. This is the incarceration rate per 100,000 people in the United States. And you can see, starting in the 1970s, it went completely bananas. And now we have a prison population of 2 million people. Many think that this is entirely driven by the war on drugs. It's not. That only accounts for about 1/3 of it. We have been putting people in prison for a longer period of time for almost every type of crime that you can imagine. The war on drugs is only part of what we're seeing here. So what I want to do now, instead, with the time that I have remaining, is I want to suggest a different kind of explanation for why people engage in crime that leads to a more optimistic conclusion about what we can do to move kids away from engaging in violence and the potential value of interventions like One Summer Chicago. And to do this, I'm hoping that you'll engage me in a bit of a game. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to show you a slide with an object in the middle, and I want you to call out the color of the object in the middle once I flash the slide, okay? So let's do an easy one for starters. You guys can do much better than that. I can see the 10 giant tubs of coffee back there and how you are way more caffeinated. We can do better than this. All right, let's go. So what happened there? Right? I think what happened there is that a bunch of you got out ahead of yourselves, right? I told you to look at the color and call out the color, and instead, at least half of you said blue instead. And so what happened there, I think that you were getting out ahead of yourselves and behaving, you see the word blue, you automatically want to say blue, right? You are behaving automatically without even thinking, despite what I'd asked you to do, right? And all of us behave automatically like this all the time, right? And so the hypothesis that I want to raise is the possibility that even a lot of the violent behavior that we see in cities like Chicago and cities all around the country might also be driven, at least in part, this is not the entire explanation, but at least in part, driven by overly automatic behavior, right? Would any normal person shoot somebody else and risk 30, 40, 50 years in prison over a bike, right? I think at least as plausible an explanation is that this kid had his gun in his waistband. He knows that all his friends know that he's the kid with the gun, and he has maybe some sort of internal script that he uses that says, I don't let my friends down, right? And then he just behaves automatically. I'm not going to let my friends down, which might make a huge amount of sense under normal circumstances, but leads to a tragedy when you've got a gun in your waistband and your adrenaline is jacked because you've got two groups of kids arguing with each other over this thing, right? And so if it is the case that this sort of automatic behavior explains at least part of the violence problem, that might give us an opportunity that might give us a candidate target for intervention to help make a difference. And so for me, that's really part of the key logic behind this program that Youth Guidance in World Sport Chicago developed and implemented in the 2009-2010 academic year in collaboration with the University of Chicago for us to study it, called Becoming a Man. And so this is it's a 27-week program. Kids participate for an hour a week. So this is done during the school year, the version that we studied. It's a small group program. Kids participate in groups of 10 to 15. They get out of a class to go. What's interesting about the 2009-2010 implementation of BAM is that the average participant only went to about 13 sessions. So this is not a very heavy touch intervention. In fact, 13 contact hours might be the sort of thing that you could even do over one summer, right? So this is not a massively intensive, long-term sort of intervention. For me, I think all the youth guidance people who developed and implement the program, they're here, and I'm sure they will be much more articulate explainers of the logic behind the program. For me, I just want to share with you briefly, before I talk about the results, I want to share with you briefly one example of what BAM does, which for me was very powerful in getting me to see why this could make such a big difference on the violence problem, particularly if a lot of it is driven by automatic, maybe even unthinking behavior. So the very first example that the kids do when they go to BAM is called the fist exercise. And so the kids get paired up. So let's say Terry and I would be a pair. And let's say Tony is our BAM counselor. Tony invented BAM. And Tony would give Terry a ball, and he'd say, Jens, you have 30 seconds to get the ball out of Terry's hand, okay? And what almost all the kids do, I understand from Tony, what almost all the kids do is they basically beat the crap out of each other for 30 seconds to get the ball out of the other kid's hand. And then Tony will say, all right, enough, switch. Now, the ball will be in my hand, and what Terry will do almost invariably will be to beat the crap out of me for 30 seconds to get the ball out, right? And then Tony will say, all right, now let's reconvene and debrief and think about what we just did and what happened, right? And so Tony will say something like, Terry, what strategy did you try and how did it work? And Terry will say something like, well, I started off by trying to pry his finger open. I think I broke his pinky, but I couldn't get the ball out. And when that didn't work, I punched him right in the face repeatedly, and he still wouldn't give the ball. And then Terry will describe, and no success. And then Tony will say something like, why didn't you ask Jens for the ball? And Terry will say something like, if I had asked him for the ball, he would have MF'd me. He would have thought I was a punk. He would have, you can imagine what Terry will say. And then Tony will turn to me and say, Jens, what would you have done had Terry asked you for the ball? And I'd say, I would just give him the stupid ball. What do I care? Now, this is an illustration of something in psychology that's called hostile attribution bias, this overly automatic assumption. It's basically mind reading. You assume that you know what other people are thinking. This is a very clever way of revealing this automatic tendency to people in a very experiential, engaging way for kids. And what I also really like about this is that it's slightly subversive. So at least in the BAM that they do in the school year, the kids get out of an academic class, and the very first thing they do is they beat the crap out of each other for 30 seconds each, right? And it really draws them in and leads to a very important aha moment for the kids. To describe what the impacts were of BAM as Youth Guidance and World Sport Chicago delivered this in 2009, 2010, I want to turn it over next to the Crime Lab's research spokesperson so we can play the video.
But I have read about and studied what BAM can do, becoming a man. And not only is it the mentoring, but when you look at the results, 40% are less who participate, less likely to be arrested for violent crimes. 40% less likely to fail their classes. And just participating, they are 10% more likely to graduate high school. And like RJ, they can actually see and envision college in their career, or in their future rather, and a career in their... We're going to take it to 40 high schools serving 2,000 young men.
So that was Mayor Emanuel, in case there was any, and that was Tony standing behind him. And when President Obama came, shortly after Mayor Emanuel held that press conference, one of the things that he did while he was here is sit in on a BAM session at Hyde Park High School, right down the street from the University of Chicago. Now, your initial reaction, some of you may have be having a reaction of the following sort. The only kids in Chicago Public School who are going to voluntarily participate. So some of you might be having this reaction. The only sort of kid who's going to sign up for a program like this is the sort of Boy Scout who's going to avoid trouble anyway, right? And to head off that line of thinking, let me tell you that Youth Guidance and World Sport Chicago partnered with us to implement the BAM study like a randomized clinical trial in medicine. We took two groups of kids identified in Chicago Public School data and basically flipped a coin with half the kids being offered the chance to participate in the program, half the kids not offered the chance to participate. So the kids that this is really an apples to apples comparison. It is the same type of kid who's getting the program and not getting the program. So this is not about a particular type of kid volunteering to participate who would have been staying out of trouble anyway. A different sort of reaction you might have is, well, maybe Youth Guidance and World Sport Chicago picked the easiest schools in Chicago to work in, right? This is a map of the city of Chicago. I don't think the color came across very well, but sort of the darker orangish, reddish, the community area, the highest homicide rate. Everyone in this room will be familiar with the high schools on the south and west side that are identified here. These are in the most violent neighborhoods in the city of Chicago on the south and west sides. A different reaction some of you might be having is, well, maybe within those schools, they identified the kids who are already doing great in school and enrolled them. 1.73 is the average GPA the year before BAM of the boys who were enrolled in the BAM study, okay? 35% of the kids who enrolled for BAM had been arrested up to the point. The average age was 15, and more than a third had been arrested by the time that they signed up for BAM. The other thing that I should say is you might think, well, it's easy to do anything on a really small scale. We identified 2,700 kids and randomly assigned them to get the program or not. So this was done at a pretty sizable scale throughout Chicago. Excuse me. I want to offer you one more example, and then I'll stop. One Summer Chicago is focusing this year on the highest risk kids, and so you might think, well, the BAM study that I just described is working with kids who are still enrolled in school. Surely this getting kids to behave less automatically and stop, look, and listen couldn't do any good with the highest risk kids. Our University of Chicago Crime Lab research team partnered with the Cook County Juvenile Temporary Detention Center to study a version of this inside the JTDC. If you know anything about the juvenile justice system in Chicago, as everyone or nearly everyone in this room does, you know that only the most serious juvenile arrestees wind up in the JTDC awaiting resolution of their juvenile cases. So these are the highest risk kids in the juvenile system in Cook County. And this is what you see in terms of return rates for some of the kids got the program in the JTDC and some of the kids didn't. And you can see, so the red bar here are the return rates to JTDC for the kids who basically got stop, look, and listen programming on the inside. And the blue bar is the return rate for the kids who didn't get that. And what you can see is by 14 months out, there's a sizable proportional reduction in the risk of coming back to the JTDC, even among the highest risk kids, right? Now, this is the final thing that I want to say now. This is really, working on these projects has really profoundly changed the way that I personally think about the youth violence problem in Chicago and what we can do about it. I think that there is as I started off saying, I think that there is a tendency among the broader public to think that the kids who are at elevated risk for violence involvement are bad kids and there's nothing you can do about it, right? They're bad kids, you can't change them. The only thing you can do is lock them up when they do something bad. I think my thinking about the problem has been changed by working this research and was really crystallized when I was in the Juvenile Temporary Detention Center and I was talking to one of the team leaders in the JTDC who told me, he said, I tell the kids in here all the time, he said, 20% of the kids in here are just criminals. You gotta lock them up, you let them out, they're just gonna do bad stuff, they've just gotta be in here. You can't do anything with them. He said, but the other 80% of the kids, I tell them all the time, if I could give you back just 10 minutes of your life, none of you would be in here, right? These are not, and I think that leads to a very different kind of thinking about the problem and what you can do about it. Now, this is not going to be a solution for the problem, but in terms of making a difference, it's not bad kids so much as bad decisions and a 10-minute window that we need to inoculate them against from making that bad decision. And I think BAM and BAM-like programs are one important way to do that, but not the only way to do that, right? And so one of the things that I find intriguing about One Sport Chicago is also the jobs component as well, right? Now, if you thought the problem was material poverty, families growing up in heartbreakingly poor conditions throughout Chicago, you might look at a summer jobs program for a kid and think, that's great, but that's not really going to be enough. I don't think anybody's under the illusion that a summer jobs program for a kid is going to lift the family necessarily out of poverty forever, right? But if you think of the problem instead as this 10-minute window, a summer jobs program could help the kid learn some of these stop, look, and listen skills, especially when it's combined with BAM and BAM-like programs. And the other thing that a summer jobs program might do is change where the kid is during that 10-minute window, right? If the kid is at work during the 10 minutes, or even if the kid's not at work, if the kid has money in his pocket now, he might be at home rather than out on the corner during that 10-minute window. And so I think the depressing part of this, when you think back to the incarceration rate in the United States over time, the depressing part of this is that we might have tragically misdiagnosed the violence problem in the United States. But I think the encouraging part of it, and one of the reasons that I'm so encouraged for why we're here for One Summer Chicago right now, is that we're starting to see some light at the end of the tunnel in terms of more humane and effective ways of steering kids and protecting them during that 10-minute window. Thank you very much.